Reaganomics was an economic policy put into play by President Reagan during his 2 terms in office. As said by him, the administration's objective will be a healthy, vigorous, growing economy that provides equal opportunities for all Americans, with no barriers born of bigotry or discrimination. Putting America back to work means putting all Americans back to work. Ending inflation means freeing all Americans from the terror of runaway living costs. All must share in the productive work of this new beginning, and all must share in the bounty of a revived economy. He wanted to cut taxes, get control of government spending, and get the government out of the way of economics so that the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people could be unleashed. In August 1981, President Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which brought reductions in individual income tax rates, the expensing of depreciable property, incentives for small businesses, and incentives for savings. 20 million jobs were created. Inflation dropped from 13.5% in 1980 to 4.1% in 1988. Unemployment fell from 7.6% to 5.5%. Net worth of families earning between 20,000 and 50,000 annually grew by 27%. Real gross national product rose 26%. The prime interest rate was slashed by more than half, from an unprecedented 21.5% in January 1981 to 10% in August 1988. In a phrase, the American dream had been restored. President Reagan is often credited with ending the Cold War. Reagan did not like the Soviets. He said, "So far, the détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. Their goal must be the promotion of a world revolution and a one-world communist or socialist state." According to President Reagan, the Soviets considered détente a sign of American weakness and vulnerability. Instead of détente, the president wanted peace through strength by building America's economic and military power. He said, "Our strategy is a defensive. Our aim is to protect the peace by ensuring that no adversaries ever conclude they could beat us in a war of their own choosing." President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative intimidated the Soviet leaders and influenced them to negotiate with him to reduce nuclear weapons. The United States supported anti-Soviet uprisings by people in various places around the world. For example, President Reagan provided material and moral support to the Solidarity movement in Poland. This brought down the Soviet-backed regime after President Reagan left office and helped to inspire other anti-Soviet rebellions. Reagan started the Star Wars and Strategic Defense Initiative to intimidate the Soviet leaders and influence them to negotiate. The intent of this program was to develop a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system in order to prevent missile attacks from other countries, specifically the Soviet Union. Reagan was a vocal critic of the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, and the Strategic Defense Initiative was an important part of his defense policy intended to end MAD as a nuclear deterrent strategy, as well as a strategic initiative to neutralize the military component of Soviet nuclear defenses. This system would tip the nuclear balance toward the United States. The Soviets feared that SDI would enable the United States to launch a first strike against them. This initiative was a huge factor in ending the Cold War. The military was diminished during the Carter years, but Reagan reversed that by rebuilding the armed forces and using peace through strength. His peace through strength philosophy was manifested by his reviving of the B-1 bomber that Carter canceled, starting production of the MX missile, and pushing NATO to deploy Pershing missiles in West Germany. He increased defense spending by more than 40%, increased troop levels, and even got much-needed space parts into the pipeline. Those efforts ensured that America remained a military superpower. President Reagan's domestic policy. Polluters were not the only criminals who President Reagan intended to put out of business. Keeping people safe was always a top-of-the-agenda item for the Reagan administration. It took a while, but in 1984, Congress passed the President's Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which kept dangerous people behind bars, restricted the use of insanity defense, reviewed federal sentencing guidelines, and toughened penalties for drug dealers and others. That same year, the President signed another very significant piece of legislation which made child pornography a separate criminal offense. The effect of the President's work to prevent crime and put criminals where they belonged was dramatic. Nearly 2 million fewer households were hit by crime in 1987 than in 1980. Preventing crime and locking up bad guys was only part of what President Reagan did to ensure justice for all. Another key component of his program was the appointment of judges who would faithfully interpret the Constitution rather than legislate from the bench. Of all the judicial appointments made by the President, none was more historically significant than Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981. When Ronald Reagan became the first president to nominate a woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court, he shattered a glass ceiling that had been placed since the founding of the country, forever changing not only the judiciary, but the role of women in our society. Little girls everywhere could now aspire to heights previously unavailable to them. Ronald Reagan acquires more than enough qualities to be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
What are your thoughts on Ronald Reagan's presidency?
I think President Reagan was one of the greatest presidents of all time, certainly of my lifetime.
How old were you when he was in office?
I was 18 when he was elected to his first term.
How do presidential elections differ now from when President Reagan was elected?
When President Reagan was elected, there certainly wasn't the social media that exists now, not the cell phones, instantaneous news coverage that we have. So I think the candidates in his era didn't have to worry about everything that they said and did was going to wind up on the 11 o'clock news.
Do you believe that his economic system helped the United States?
Yes, I do. It stimulated economic growth, curbed inflation, increased jobs, cut taxes, and cut government spending.
Did you agree with Ronald Reagan's domestic policy at the time? Why or why not?
Well, I was a little young to be real concerned about domestic policy, but I can tell you that my family certainly felt better during that time. It wasn't a time of great inflation. There wasn't as many worries about money. We certainly felt like we were better off in the Reagan years than we were before.
Do you think that the GOP party idolizes Ronald Reagan? Why or why not?
Well, I think idolize is kind of a negative term. I think that insinuates that you're making something out greater than it really was. I think the Republican Party certainly respects and admires what he did for the country.
Do you believe that Ronald Reagan should be inducted into the Hall of Fame? Why or why not?
Yes, I do. The domestic policies that we've already talked about, his relationship with foreign governments, really bringing an end to the Cold War, supporting Germany with bringing down the Berlin Wall. I think all of those things had a long-lasting effect on not only our country, but the world.
Perhaps the most significant broken promise of Obama's stimulus was that it would keep the unemployment rate below 8%. This was the promise Obama and White House economists made to sell the stimulus to the public. Had Obama's projections been a reality, the economy would have recovered to roughly where it had been prior to the 2008 financial crash. Not only did unemployment not stay below 8%, it hit 10.1% in October of 2009. The actual U3 employment rate at the end of Obama's first term was 7.8%. Obama promised it would be 5.2% with the stimulus. The Keystone XL pipeline bill was introduced on January 29, 2015. President Obama vetoed the bill on February 24, 2015. The Keystone pipeline would deliver 700,000 barrels a day of crude oil from Canada to coastal Texas oil refineries. Delivering oil via pipeline is more cost-effective than shipping via rail. The pipeline would also create an estimated 20,000 jobs. More jobs and cheaper energy are exactly what this country needs, but Obama chose to deny TransCanada's permit. The president has almost doubled our national debt in just 3.5 years, something that has never happened in American history. We've accumulated more debt in the past 42 months than all of the previous 232 years of this republic. That's impossible to overlook. Our nation has lost our AAA credit rating, and our national debt has increased approximately $69,000 per household during Obama's presidency. A federal operation dubbed Fast and Furious allowed weapons from the U.S. to pass into the hands of suspected gun smugglers, so the arms could be traced to the higher echelons of Mexican drug cartels. Obama's administration allowed for the federal operation to take place. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, which ran the operation, has lost track of hundreds of firearms, many of which have been linked to crimes, including the fatal shooting of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry in December 2010. Americans celebrating Martin Luther King Day today should be proud of the incredible progress made since the civil rights leader's birth 87 years ago. At the same time, we should lament one of the President Obama's greatest failures. The last Democratic president and the last Republican president both managed race relations more effectively than Obama has. 7 years after American voters made history by electing the country's first black president, racial tensions have worsened. Ferguson has become shorthand for African American fury objecting to insensitive white cops harassing young blacks. The Black Lives Matter movement has spilled into American campus culture as privileged kids attending the world's finest universities bemoan their alleged oppression, bullying anyone who challenges them. Amid this tension, Obama has been disturbingly passive, even during America's first serious race riot since 1992. He acts like a meteorologist observing bad weather, not a president able to shape the political climate.
We have decided to nominate the current president for the Hall of Shame. One of the reasons we gave was the national debt. Do you feel that the president is responsible for the ballooning of the national debt?
I do believe the president plays a part in the increase in the national debt. I think there's a difference in the makeup of the national debt as opposed to prior administrations. The current administration has increased the debt on a lot of government jobs, government spending, entitlement programs. Previous presidents have increased the debt on things like military spending, infrastructure, jobs in manufacturing companies. The problem is that by doubling the national debt with the programs that he has, the economic base is much weaker and now $20 trillion in debt.
We cited the unemployment rate as a reason for nomination. Do you think this weakened the economic base has impacted unemployment?
Yes, I do believe mentioning that weakened base that I did when you were asking about the debt, that base is now lacking a lot of manufacturing jobs. It's lacking a lot of the infrastructure that we had previously. A lot of manufacturing jobs in particular, have moved out of the country. So unemployment has risen, and I believe actual unemployment is higher than the reported numbers. It has been higher than 10% under Obama during his first term. And I believe actual underemployment is higher than that. A lot of jobs are now part-time that used to be full-time, and those are still reported as employed.
You run a company, and based on your experience, do you feel that Obamacare has affected your employees' health care, costs, and services positively or negatively?
Well, I believe that when Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, was instituted, the goal was to have cheaper health care for everyone, and including employees and corporations and people that do have health care already. The average cost per worker has actually gone up since the Affordable Care Act was instituted. And I believe that's the case outside of just the employees that I'm familiar with. I think healthcare costs have increased and not decreased because of the act.
Do you think the current administration's energy policies are beneficial?
I do not believe they're beneficial. We all care about the environment, and we all believe that we have to have alternatives to fossil fuel. But we also need to have affordable energy to do things like produce goods and have electricity for our homes. The problem that we've seen is that we've gone after things like solar energy, we've gone after wind energy, and they just have not been very efficient. Instituting the Keystone Pipeline would have reduced the cost for fossil fuels to people in the U.S., and the alternatives have not come to fruition, and we should be looking at other types of energy, in my opinion, including nuclear, that is inexpensive and clean.
How do you think Obama has performed on the war on terror?
I believe we're in a weaker position than we were previously. We've seen the growth of ISIS or ISIL. I think one of the core problems is the administration is having trouble identifying the enemy in the war on terror. We have been very careful not to name radical religions as terrorists, and while I do not believe that religions have a terrorist base, I believe the radical forms of certain religions do promote terrorism. And the administration will not recognize this, and it makes it very difficult to identify our enemies. We're weaker abroad. We've pulled a lot of troops out of countries that are very unstable, and I believe that makes us weaker at home.
Thank you.